When I shattered my shoulder in a warehouse accident, I called my parents from a hospital bed and asked for help paying rent and bills. They said they couldn't afford it and told me to figure it out. 8 months later, I sat at their Thanksgiving table and learned they'd just given my little brother $50,000 for a house. Now they're broke, the house is in foreclosure, and they want my help. If you're interested in this gist, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My name is Jenna, I'm 32 years old, and I learned very early in life that if I wanted stability, safety, or success, I was going to have to build it myself. Not because my parents were cruel or absent in the obvious ways people imagine, but because in our family there were two roles, and I was never the one worth rescuing. From the outside, we looked normal, even respectable. 2 parents, 2 kids, a tidy house in a decent neighborhood, steady jobs, holiday dinners, birthday cards. But inside the house, there was an unspoken rule that shaped everything. My younger brother needed protection, and I needed to be strong. My brother, Evan, was sensitive according to my parents. He felt things deeply. He needed encouragement. He needed patience. Every mistake he made came with a cushion underneath it. When he forgot homework, my mom drove it to school. When he failed a test, my dad blamed the teacher. When he got caught drinking in high school, it was dismissed as experimenting. Me, I was capable. That was their favorite word. Capable of handling pressure. Capable of figuring things out. Capable of not needing help. When I got a single C sophomore year, I was grounded for a month. When I pointed out the difference, my dad said the sentence that would follow me for decades. Evan needs more support. You're tough. You'll be fine. What that really meant was simple. They expected less from him and more from me. And they never questioned whether that was fair. By 16, I was working part-time after school. Not for spending money, but because I already knew college wasn't going to be handed to me. My parents weren't struggling financially. My dad worked operations at a regional distribution center. My mom had a part-time job in insurance. They owned their home. They had savings. They even had a college fund. Just not one meant for me. When I asked about help with tuition, my mom smiled and said earning it yourself builds character. Evan's college fund sat untouched while he explored his options. I went to community college first, transferred to state school, worked full-time during breaks and part-time during semesters, lived with roommates I barely knew, and graduated with a logistics degree and nearly $30,000 in student loans. No celebration, no pride, just a distracted, "That's good," before the conversation turned back to Evan's future. After college, I got a job at a large warehouse shipping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady and I was good at it. I learned systems quickly, took extra shifts, stayed late. Over 6 years, I worked my way into a supervisory role, making just over $50,000 a year. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. I had my own apartment. I was paying down debt. I had savings. I wasn't asking anyone for anything. Meanwhile, Evan dropped out of college after a year and moved back home rent-free. My parents framed it as a journey. Finding himself, discovering his passion. Every family dinner revolved around his feelings, his plans, his stress. When I mentioned promotions or raises, the response was always the same. "That's nice, honey." Then back to Evan. The accident happened last October. We were rushing inventory at the warehouse, behind schedule, understaffed, pressure coming down from management to move faster. I was on a scissor lift checking high shelving. The floor wasn't level. The weight shifted. The lift tipped. I fell nearly 12 feet onto concrete. I remember the sound before the pain, the sharp crack that didn't feel real at first. Then I couldn't breathe. My collarbone snapped. 3 ribs fractured. My shoulder was damaged badly enough to require surgery. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying not to black out while coworkers called for help. Surgery fixed the worst of it, but recovery was brutal. Doctors told me I'd be out of work 4 to 6 months. Workers' comp covered medical bills and part of my income, but not enough to survive comfortably. My company had a policy that allowed them to eliminate positions after 90 days of medical leave. I did the math lying in a hospital bed. I was about to lose thousands of dollars a month. I couldn't lift my arm, couldn't drive, couldn't even dress myself properly. I needed help, real help. So I did something I almost never did. I called my parents. I explained everything. The injury, the surgery, the lost income, the risk of losing my job. I asked if they could help me cover rent and utilities temporarily. Asked if I could stay with them for a month or two while I healed. My dad didn't hesitate. He said money was tight. My mom echoed him, said her hours had been cut, said they had bills too. She told me I was always so independent and resourceful, suggested I look into assistance programs or ask friends. I hung up the phone feeling something deeper than anger. Betrayal. This wasn't about favoritism anymore. This was about survival. And they chose not to show up. A friend from work, Carla, and her husband offered me their spare room. They helped me move, helped me shower, helped me eat. People who owed me nothing stepped in while the people who raised me disappeared. I cried the first night in their house, not from pain, but from the realization that strangers cared more about my well-being than my own parents. Physical therapy was brutal, financial stress constant. My savings vanished. I sold my car, missed loan payments, watched my credit score collapse. Through all of it, my parents never visited, never checked in beyond short texts. Meanwhile, Evan posted pictures online of family dinners and weekend outings like nothing had happened. By the time I was cleared to return to work, my position was gone. I was offered a lower-paying role or nothing. I took it because I had no choice. I started rebuilding slowly, painfully, piece by piece. And then Thanksgiving came. The dinner where everything snapped into focus. The dinner where I learned my parents, who couldn't afford to help me survive, had somehow found $50,000 to help my brother buy a house. That moment didn't just hurt. It rewrote how I saw my entire childhood. And what happened after that is where this story truly begins. I almost didn't go to Thanksgiving dinner that year. After everything that had happened, after months of struggling through recovery, debt, and humiliation with barely a word from my parents, the idea of sitting at their table felt like reopening a wound that had just started to scar over. But loneliness has a way of bargaining with your pride. I told myself it would just be one meal, a few hours. I could survive that. I wasn't going for them. I was going because I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know whether the people who raised me even understood what they'd done. When I pulled into their driveway, the first thing I noticed was the house. It looked different. Not subtly different. Obviously different. New exterior lights. Fresh landscaping. A new car parked in the driveway that definitely hadn't been there before. My stomach tightened before I even stepped out of my car. Inside, it was worse. Brand new sectional couch. A massive flat-screen TV, mounted on the wall. The kitchen looked like it had been ripped out and rebuilt. Granite countertops. Stainless steel appliances. Everything gleamed. While I'd been sleeping in a spare room, struggling to lift my arm, selling my car to pay rent, my parents had been renovating. Evan greeted me with a lazy smile and a half-hug that felt more like obligation than affection. He looked relaxed, comfortable, wearing expensive clothes I knew he didn't buy himself. My mom fussed over the turkey. My dad sat in a new recliner watching football. No one asked how my shoulder was. No one asked how work was going. No one asked how I'd survived the last year. The conversation stayed shallow on purpose. Weather, traffic, a movie Evan had seen. I pushed food around my plate, feeling like a guest in a house that no longer felt familiar. Halfway through dinner, Evan started talking about apartments, or rather, houses. He was animated in a way I hadn't seen in years, talking about neighborhoods, yards, interest rates. My parents leaned in, proud, engaged, suddenly alive. My chest tightened with every sentence. Something wasn't adding up. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Wait, you're buying a house. The table went quiet. My dad looked at me like I'd missed an obvious memo. Yes, he said. It's time Evan got his own place. I asked the question I already dreaded hearing the answer to. How are you helping him? My parents exchanged a look. My mom answered too quickly. Just a little help with the down payment. Evan, oblivious to the tension, grinned. They're giving me $50,000. Isn't that amazing? $50,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. My ears rang. These were the same people who told me they couldn't afford to help me keep a roof over my head while I recovered from surgery. The same people who told me money was tight. I stared at my plate, then back at them. So you had the money, I said quietly. You just didn't have it for me. My dad stiffened. This is different. I laughed, but it came out hollow. Different how? Because I was injured and needed help to survive, and he just wants a house. My mom tried to soothe things, telling me they'd saved for years, that it wasn't extra money, that Evan needed stability. The words barely registered. All I could see was the pattern laid bare. When Evan struggled, he was supported. When I struggled, I was abandoned. I stood up from the table. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just said, I needed you, and you weren't there. Then I walked out. I sat in my car shaking for 20 minutes before I could drive. That night, something in me finally broke clean instead of cracking slowly. The hope that they might change. The fantasy that one day they'd see me. I stopped reaching out after that. When they texted, I kept responses short. When they guilt me, I didn't engage. I focused on rebuilding my life. I worked overtime, took weekend shifts, picked up side consulting work. Every dollar went to debt, savings, stability. It was exhausting, but it was mine. Months passed. My credit score improved. I paid off cards. I got promoted again, slowly clawing my way back to where I'd been before the injury. I moved into a better apartment, bought a reliable car with cash. For the first time since the accident, I felt solid again. Not happy exactly, but grounded. Then the call came. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. I didn't. It was Evan. His voice was tight, rushed, nervous. He danced around small talk before finally saying it. He was behind on his mortgage. His hours had been cut. The bills were piling up. The bank was threatening foreclosure. I listened quietly while he spiraled. Then he asked, could I loan him $5,000 to catch up? Just temporarily. He'd pay me back. He sounded desperate. And all I could think was how familiar that desperation felt. I asked if he'd asked our parents. He went quiet. They couldn't help. They were having money problems. My stomach dropped. Over the next few minutes, the truth spilled out. My dad had lost his job months earlier. Bad investments. Savings gone. They were selling the house. Planning to move in with Evan temporarily. Except Evan was about to lose the house. They needed me. All of them needed me. I said no. Calmly. Clearly. Without apology. Evan accused me of holding a grudge. Of being cold. Of letting family suffer. I reminded him who suffered first. I reminded him who was told to figure it out. Then I hung up. 2 days later, my parents called. They pleaded. They justified. They minimized the past and magnified the present. They told me I was being unreasonable. That family helps family. I told them they taught me independence. I was simply honoring the lesson. When my mom admitted they were scared, really scared, I felt a flicker of sympathy. It didn't move my boundary. I refused to give them money. Refused to fix what they broke. When they tried guilt, I held firm. When they sent relatives to pressure me, I shut that down too. I explained the truth once. After that, I stopped explaining. I blocked numbers. I protected my peace. It felt wrong at first, like I was betraying some sacred rule. But the longer I sat with it, the clearer it became. I wasn't punishing them. I was choosing myself for the first time in my life. They lost the house. Evan moved back in with them. 3 people who had always relied on someone else to catch them suddenly had no net. Through a distant relative, I heard my parents were telling people I abandoned them, that I was heartless. A terrible daughter. I didn't correct the story. I didn't need to. The people who mattered knew the truth. The friends who carried me through recovery. The coworkers who watched me rebuild. The family I chose. What my parents never understood is that forgiveness isn't access. Love doesn't mean unlimited sacrifice. You can care about people and still refuse to save them from the consequences of their own choices. I didn't win anything by saying no. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. And that steadiness came from something new. Self-respect. I survived without them when I needed them most. They could survive without me now. And for the first time, that wasn't my burden to carry. After I blocked their numbers, the silence felt strange at first. Not peaceful. Not heavy. Just unfamiliar. My phone stopped lighting up with passive-aggressive messages, guilt-laced check-ins, and sudden emergencies that were never actually about me. For the first few days, I kept catching myself reaching for it, half expecting another call or text. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I had been trained to anticipate their needs, to brace for their disappointment, to stay ready to explain myself. When none of that came, it left an empty space that felt almost dangerous, like standing on solid ground after years of walking on a swaying bridge. The quiet gave me room to think, and thinking forced me to confront something I had avoided for most of my life. I wasn't just angry about the injury. I wasn't just hurt about the money. I was grieving the parents I kept hoping I had. The ones who would show up when things got hard. The ones who wouldn't rank their children based on usefulness or potential. The ones who wouldn't call neglect tough love. I had spent years chasing a version of them that didn't exist, believing that if I worked harder, struggled more quietly, or proved myself enough, they would eventually treat me like I mattered. That realization hit harder than the fall that broke my shoulder, because it meant the pain wasn't temporary. It wasn't circumstantial. It was structural. It was baked into the way my family functioned. Evan wasn't just favored. He was protected, shielded, rescued. I was the opposite. I was the one expected to endure, to absorb damage without complaint, to rebuild alone and call it strength. Once I saw that clearly, it became impossible to unsee. I started therapy not long after cutting contact, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to understand why it took me so long to stop accepting mistreatment. My therapist asked me a question in the first session that stuck with me. When did you learn that your needs were less important than everyone else's? I laughed at first, then realized I didn't have a specific memory because it had always been that way. From childhood chores to college finances to medical recovery, the pattern was consistent. My needs were optional. Everyone else's were urgent. We unpacked how praise in my family was conditional, how love was transactional, how independence wasn't celebrated in me, it was required, and how that requirement conveniently freed my parents from responsibility while allowing them to frame themselves as fair. They didn't see themselves as neglectful. They saw themselves as practical, realistic, and I had spent decades internalizing that logic, telling myself I was fine, that others had it worse, that asking for help was weakness, until I asked, and the answer was no. Work became my anchor during that period. Routine helped. Structure helped. I threw myself into my job, not to escape, but to reclaim control. I volunteered for projects no one wanted, took responsibility without waiting to be asked. Slowly, people began to notice again, not because I was desperate to prove something, but because I had always been capable. The difference now was that I stopped giving that capability away for free. When my manager asked me to take on extra responsibilities, I asked about compensation. When a coworker tried to dump work on me because I could handle it, I said no. Each boundary felt awkward at first, like using muscles I'd never exercised, but it got easier. Outside of work, my life got quieter in a good way. Fewer obligations, fewer emotional landmines. I spent weekends resting instead of racing, cooking meals I actually enjoyed, sitting on my balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the city wake up. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me, Not to my parents' expectations. Not to my brother's needs. Not to some invisible scoreboard I'd been losing it since childhood. Of course, the guilt didn't vanish. It crept in during quiet moments. Late at night. Early mornings. Little whispers asking if I was being cruel. If I was overreacting. If cutting them off made me just as bad. That's when I reminded myself of the facts, not the feelings. I didn't cut them off because they struggled. I cut them off because they abandoned me when I was vulnerable, then expected access when they were. I didn't refuse to help out of revenge. I refused because helping would have reinforced the same dynamic that had always existed. Me sacrificing, them benefiting, nothing changing. About a month after everything went down, I ran into my aunt, my mother's older sister, at a grocery store. She'd always been kind in a quiet way, never confrontational, but observant. She hugged me and asked how I was really doing. I told her the truth, that I was okay, that I was healing. She hesitated, then said softly, "Your parents are telling people you abandoned them." I nodded. I'd expected that. I figured. She sighed. "I don't agree with them. I never have. I saw how different things were between you and Evan." That small validation meant more than I expected. Sometimes you don't need everyone to understand. You just need to know you're not imagining things. Through her, I learned how things were unfolding. My parents downsized fast. The apartment was small. The tension was high. Evan struggled to find steady work. The same independence they admired in him suddenly frustrated them. The same excuses they once made became burdens. The dynamic shifted, and from what I heard, it wasn't pretty. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of vindication. Not joy, just confirmation. But even that faded quickly. I wasn't interested in watching them suffer. I was interested in moving forward. One evening, after a long day, I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to send, just to get everything out. I wrote about the injury, the phone call from the hospital, the fear, the nights wondering how I'd survive. I wrote about Thanksgiving, the renovations, the $50,000, the moment something inside me shut down for good. I wrote about the call asking for money, the audacity, the guilt trips, the relatives. And then I wrote about myself, about the strength it took to rebuild without support, about the people who stepped up when my family didn't, about the pride I felt paying off my debts dollar by dollar. When I finished, I realized something important. I didn't want an apology anymore. I didn't need closure from them. I had given it to myself. I tore the letter up and threw it away. Not because it didn't matter, but because it had already served its purpose. I had said everything I needed to say. Even if no one else heard it. There's a lie people tell about family. That blood overrides behavior. That history excuses harm. That forgiveness requires access. None of that is true. Family is supposed to be a place of safety, not a test of endurance. And when it isn't, you're allowed to leave. You're allowed to stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. That doesn't make you heartless. It makes you honest. I don't know what the future holds with my parents or my brother. Maybe they'll change. Maybe they won't. That's not something I can control. What I can control is the life I build, the standards I set, and the way I treat myself. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can endure. I measure it by how well I protect my peace. And that, more than anything, is what finally set me free. By the time winter settled in, I had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its steadiness. Mornings were quiet. No anxious checking of my phone. No bracing for emotional fallout. I woke up, made coffee, stretched my shoulder the way my physical therapist taught me, and started my day without the background noise of obligation. That absence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I had built it brick by brick, boundary by boundary, and the more distance it put between myself and my parents, the clearer my mind became. I could finally see how much emotional energy I had been spending just trying to survive my family dynamic. Once that drain was gone, everything else started to improve faster than I expected. Physically, my shoulder continued to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. I could lift grocery bags again. I could sleep without waking up in pain. Every small milestone felt like proof that I was moving forward, even if slowly. Emotionally, the progress was quieter but deeper. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped imagining alternate versions of events where my parents suddenly understood me. I stopped waiting for validation that was never going to come. That was a grief all its own, but it was also freeing. Acceptance doesn't feel good at first. It feels like letting go of hope, but eventually it feels like peace. Work continued to stabilize. My supervisor started looping me into planning meetings again, asking my opinion instead of just assigning tasks. One afternoon, he pulled me aside and said something I didn't expect. He told me he admired how I handled the setback, that he'd seen people fall apart over far less. That resilience like mine was rare. I thanked him, but internally, I corrected the narrative. It wasn't just resilience. It was necessity. I survived because I had no other choice. Still, being seen for my effort instead of overlooked felt good. It felt deserved. Outside of work, my support system grew in quiet ways. Carlos and his wife remained constants, checking in without hovering, offering help without conditions. Friends I drifted from during the injury started reconnecting, not because I chased them, but because I finally had the energy to show up as myself again. I learned how different relationships felt when they weren't transactional, when no one kept score, when care didn't come with strings attached. It changed the way I looked at love, loyalty, and family. About 2 months after cutting contact, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. I stared at it for a long time before deciding to read it. The letter was long and rambling. Parts of it were defensive. Parts were self-pitying. She talked about how hard things had been, how scared they were, how she never imagined things would turn out this way. She mentioned my brother's struggles in detail, framing him as overwhelmed and misunderstood. Toward the end, there was an attempt at apology, but it was vague. "I'm sorry if you felt unsupported," she wrote. "That was never our intention." I folded the letter and set it aside. It confirmed what I already knew. They were still centered on themselves, still avoiding responsibility, still hoping time would smooth things over without real accountability. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. Silence, for once, felt like the most honest answer. That silence forced my parents to sit with their choices in a way they never had before. I learned later that without me as a buffer, without the strong one absorbing pressure, their household became tense. Arguments escalated. Old excuses stopped working. My brother struggled without someone fixing things for him. The same independence that had been demanded of me was suddenly expected of him, and he didn't know how to carry it. I didn't feel satisfaction in that knowledge, just clarity. Favoritism doesn't prepare someone for adulthood. It delays it. As spring approached, I started thinking about the future differently, not in terms of what I owed anyone, but in terms of what I wanted. I set goals that had nothing to do with proving myself. I focused on financial security, building a real emergency fund, investing in my health, and slowly reclaiming joy. I signed up for a class I'd always wanted to take. I planned a small trip for myself, nothing extravagant, just a few days away to mark how far I'd come. For the first time, my life wasn't shaped around damage control. It was shaped around intention. One afternoon, while cleaning out old files, I found hospital paperwork for my injury, notes from doctors, dates, bills. Seeing it all again stirred something heavy, but also grounding. It reminded me that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a miscommunication. I had been vulnerable, scared, and in pain. I had asked for help. The answer had been no. That truth anchored me whenever doubt crept in. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're responses. A few weeks later, my brother tried to reach out through social media. A short message. Apologetic in tone, but light on substance. He said he missed me. that things were hard, that he wished we could talk. I sat with the message for a long time before replying. Eventually, I wrote back honestly. I told him I wasn't ready, that what happened hadn't been addressed, that I needed accountability, not just regret. He didn't respond after that, and that was okay. Growth doesn't always happen at the same pace for everyone. What surprised me most during this time was how much compassion I developed for myself. Not pity, not self-indulgence. Compassion. I stopped minimizing my experience. I stopped comparing my pain to others. I allowed myself to acknowledge that what I went through was traumatic, not because of the injury alone, but because of the abandonment that followed. Naming it gave it less power. I also started noticing how often people excuse harmful behavior in the name of family, how quick they are to judge boundaries without understanding context. I learned that you don't owe anyone access to your life just because you share DNA. You owe yourself safety, dignity, and peace. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away, even when it hurts. Looking back, I see now that my parents didn't suddenly become cruel during my injury. They were consistent. The difference was that I was no longer able or willing to absorb the cost. That moment forced a reckoning, not just for them, but for me. It forced me to choose between repeating a familiar pattern or breaking it. I chose to break it. I don't know if there will ever be reconciliation. Maybe one day, there will be honest conversations, real apologies, meaningful change. Maybe there won't. Either way, my life no longer revolves around that possibility. I've learned that closure doesn't require permission. Healing doesn't require consensus. And strength doesn't come from enduring neglect. It comes from refusing to accept it. This chapter of my life taught me something invaluable. That independence is not the absence of support. It's the ability to choose who deserves a place in your world. And for the first time, I chose myself. By early summer, the world around me felt different, not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood where I stood in it. The constant low-level anxiety I had carried for years, the feeling that I was one mistake away from being judged or abandoned, had faded. It didn't disappear overnight. It loosened gradually, like a knot untangling itself strand by strand. And with that release came clarity. I started seeing my past not as a series of personal failures, but as evidence of how much I had survived without support. One of the hardest truths to accept was that my parents' behavior wasn't situational. It wasn't caused by stress or bad timing or financial strain alone. It was patterned, consistent, predictable. And once I recognized that, it reframed everything. The injury didn't create the fracture. It exposed it. When I stopped making excuses for them, I also stopped blaming myself for the distance that followed. That realization didn't make me cold. It made me careful. I became more intentional about the people I let into my life. I paid attention to how others responded when I set boundaries. Some respected them immediately. Some tested them. A few disappeared entirely. And instead of chasing those people or questioning myself, I let them go. That was new and surprisingly peaceful. Financially, things continued to improve. I hit goals that once felt impossible. My emergency fund reached a level that allowed me to breathe. I paid down the last lingering debt from the injury. Each payment felt symbolic, like reclaiming a piece of my autonomy that had been stripped away. During recovery, money had always been a tool of control in my family. Who deserved help? Who didn't? Who was worth investing in? Now my finances represented something else entirely. Freedom. I started mentoring a younger coworker at my job, a woman fresh out of college who reminded me of myself years ago. Overworked, eager to prove herself, afraid to say no. One afternoon, she apologized for asking too many questions. I told her something I wish someone had told me earlier. Asking questions doesn't make you a burden. It means you're engaged. Her relief was immediate. In that moment, I realized how deeply I'd internalized the idea that needing anything made me inconvenient. Passing on a healthier perspective felt like breaking a cycle in a small but meaningful way. Around this time, I ran into an old family friend at a coffee shop, someone who had known my parents for decades. She smiled warmly and asked how my family was doing. I hesitated, then answered honestly, "I'm not in contact with them right now." Her smile faltered. She gave me the familiar look, the one that says, "But they're your parents." I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I simply said, "I needed space to heal." She nodded slowly, uncertain, but she didn't argue. That felt like progress. Not everyone needs the full story. Not everyone deserves it. A month later, I received another message from my brother. Longer this time. He admitted he was struggling, that things weren't what he expected, that he felt lost without the safety net he'd always relied on. He apologized more directly, acknowledging that he hadn't shown up for me when I needed him. I read the message several times. It was the most honest he'd ever been. Still, honesty alone didn't erase the past. I replied carefully. I told him I appreciated the apology, that I hoped he figured things out, but that I wasn't ready to step back into the role of emotional support or problem solver, that I needed distance to protect what I was building. He said he understood. Whether he truly did or not wasn't something I could control. What I could control was how I responded to the guilt that followed. It flared up unexpectedly, especially when I thought about how my parents were living now. Smaller apartment, fewer comforts, a life that looked nothing like the one they'd worked so hard to project. There was a voice in my head that said I could fix it, that I should fix it, that doing so would make me the bigger person. I recognized that voice. It was the same one that had kept me silent for years. I didn't listen to it anymore. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If I help now, what lesson does that reinforce? The answer was always the same. It would teach them that my boundaries were temporary, that my pain was negotiable, that no matter how they treated me, I would eventually step in and absorb the consequences. I refused to teach that lesson again. As the months passed, I noticed something unexpected. I laughed more. I slept better. My body felt lighter, not just because my shoulder had healed, but because I wasn't carrying other people's emotional weight anymore. I started dating again. Slowly, carefully. I paid attention to how potential partners responded to my independence. Those who found it threatening didn't last long. Those who respected it intrigued me. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking myself to be palatable. I was simply being honest about who I was and what I needed. One evening, sitting on my balcony as the sun dipped below the skyline, I thought about the version of myself from a year ago. Injured, scared, calling my parents from a hospital bed, hoping for reassurance. I felt a wave of compassion for her. She didn't know yet how strong she was. She didn't know that the rejection she felt would become the catalyst for her freedom. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this. You will survive this. And more than that, you will grow beyond it. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can endure without complaint. I measure it by how well I honor myself. That shift changed everything. It changed how I work, how I love, how I rest, how I say no. Family, I've learned, isn't defined by obligation. It's defined by care, by presence, by showing up when it matters most. The people who did that for me weren't the ones who share my last name. They were the ones who sat with me when I cried, who opened their home when I had nowhere else to go, who treated my vulnerability with respect instead of inconvenience. I don't know what my parents tell themselves now. Maybe they believe I'm ungrateful. Maybe they believe I've changed for the worse. Maybe they believe they did the best they could. None of that changes the reality of what happened. And I no longer need them to understand it for me to move on. This part of my life taught me that walking away isn't always an act of anger. Sometimes it's an act of self-preservation. Sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do for yourself. And sometimes, the hardest goodbyes are the ones that allow you to finally say hello to the life you were always meant to live. By the time autumn rolled around, I realized something else had shifted inside me. I was no longer waiting for closure from my parents. That surprised me. For most of my adult life, I'd imagined some future conversation, where they would finally understand, finally apologize in a way that felt complete and satisfying. I used to replay those imaginary moments in my head, rewriting the past, hoping the ending would change. Somewhere along the way, I stopped doing that. I didn't need their acknowledgement to validate what I'd lived through. I already knew the truth. That didn't mean the memories stopped surfacing. Certain things still triggered them. Walking past the hospital where I'd had surgery, seeing someone in a sling at the grocery store, even small comments from coworkers about how lucky they were to have parents who helped them during tough times. Those moments still stung, but they didn't knock the wind out of me anymore. They passed through instead of settling in my chest. I also started noticing how often women, like me, carry unspoken expectations. Be resilient. Be understanding. Be the one who doesn't make a fuss. Growing up, I'd been praised for being low maintenance, for not asking for much, for handling things. I used to think those compliments meant I was strong. Now I saw them for what they often are. Permission for other people to neglect you without guilt. Once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. At work, this awareness changed how I operated. I stopped automatically taking on extra tasks just because I was capable. I started saying, "I don't have the bandwidth for that right now," without apologizing. The first few times felt uncomfortable. My voice even shook once. But nothing terrible happened. The world didn't collapse. People adjusted. Some even respected me more for it. That was another quiet lesson. Boundaries don't push the right people away. They clarify who belongs. Around this time, I received a message from my mother through a relative. She'd found a way around being blocked. The message was short, almost formal. She said she hoped I was well, and that she missed me. No mention of the injury. No acknowledgement of the house. No accountability. Just a statement designed to reopen the door without addressing why it had closed. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. That was one of the hardest parts for people outside the situation to understand. They assume no contact means constant rage or bitterness. In reality, it's often the opposite. It's calm. It's quiet. It's choosing not to reopen wounds that someone else refuses to treat with care. I didn't hate my parents. I simply no longer trusted them with access to my life. My brother tried again a few weeks later, this time through social media. He sent a message saying he felt like everything had fallen apart and that he was finally starting to see things differently. He said living back in a cramped apartment with our parents was eye-opening, that the dynamic he once benefited from now suffocated him. There was a part of me that felt sympathy, another part that recognized the pattern. Insight born from discomfort isn't the same as accountability. I replied briefly, wishing him well, but reiterating that I needed space. I didn't offer advice. I didn't offer solutions. That wasn't my role anymore. Instead, I poured my energy into building something steady for myself. I enrolled in an online certification program related to my field, something I'd always wanted to do, but never felt secure enough to start. Studying again was intimidating at first. I worried I'd fallen behind, that I wasn't smart enough. Those old doubts crept in fast, but each module I completed chipped away at them. Each small success reminded me that my capabilities had never been the issue. Socially, my circle became smaller but stronger. I spent more time with people who showed consistency, friends who checked in without being prompted, who celebrated my wins without comparison, who didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. I stopped oversharing with people who hadn't earned my vulnerability. That alone saved me so much emotional energy. There was one evening that stands out clearly in my memory. I was at dinner with friends, laughing, telling a story about something ridiculous that had happened at work. Mid-laugh, I caught myself. I was genuinely happy. Not distracted happy or pretending happy. Just content. That realization hit me harder than any argument I'd ever had with my family. I had built this moment, despite everything. Later that night, I journaled something that still sits with me. I didn't lose my family. I lost the illusion of one. Writing it down felt final in a way conversations never did. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And honesty, I've learned, is grounding. The holidays came and went. I spent them with friends. Quiet meals. No tension. No walking on eggshells. No subtle digs disguised as concern. It was different. A little strange at first, but also freeing. I didn't dread the calendar anymore. I didn't brace myself for disappointment. I chose where I went and who I spent time with. That choice alone felt revolutionary. Financially, I reached another milestone. My emergency fund hit 6 months of expenses. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely secure. Not rich, not untouchable, but prepared. I remembered lying in that hospital bed, wondering how I would survive the next few months. Remembering that version of myself made the achievement feel even more meaningful. Sometimes, I wondered what my parents thought when they realized I wasn't coming back. Whether they expected me to eventually cave. Whether they believed I was bluffing. I'll probably never know. And that's okay. Their internal narrative isn't mine to manage. What I do know is this. When someone shows you, repeatedly, that your pain is inconvenient to them, believe them. When they only show up once the consequences of their choices land on their own doorstep, pay attention. Compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. Love doesn't require silence. And forgiveness doesn't require re-entry. I used to think strength meant enduring. Now I know it also means choosing yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you relationships you were taught to prioritize above all else. Especially then, the injury took a lot from me. My job, my savings, my sense of safety. But it also gave me something invaluable. Perspective. It stripped away denial and forced me to see my family dynamics for what they were. Painful, yes, but clarifying. If there's one thing this chapter of my life taught me, it's that independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about choosing who you allow to stand beside you. And I finally chose wisely. By winter, the silence from my parents had settled into something predictable. Predictability, I learned, can be oddly comforting when chaos used to be the norm. I no longer checked my phone expecting a guilt-laced message or a sudden demand disguised as concern. My days had a rhythm now. Wake up, work, study, cook, sleep. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Still, emotional distance doesn't mean emotional erasure. There were moments when grief surfaced quietly, not for the parents I had, but for the ones I needed and never got. I grieved the idea of being cared for without conditions. I grieved the version of myself who believed that if she just worked harder, needed less, complained less, then eventually she'd earn equal love. That grief didn't announce itself loudly. It showed up in small ways. Catching myself hesitating before asking a friend for help. Feeling uneasy when someone offered kindness without strings. Healing isn't linear. It loops back on itself when you least expect it. One evening, while sorting old paperwork, I came across hospital discharge forms from the injury. Dates, notes, restrictions. Patient requires assistance with daily activities. I stared at that line for a long time. That was written in plain, clinical language. No emotion, no judgment, just fact. And yet, that need had been treated like an inconvenience by the people who were supposed to care most. Seeing it written that way stripped away any lingering self-doubt. I hadn't imagined my need. I hadn't exaggerated. I had been vulnerable, and I had been refused. That wasn't weakness. That was truth. Around this time, I started therapy again. Not crisis therapy like after the injury, but deeper work. The kind that digs into patterns instead of emergencies. My therapist helped me put words to things I'd always felt, but never named. Conditional love, emotional neglect, parentification, the way I'd been praised for being easy, while silently absorbing responsibilities that weren't mine. Saying those words out loud felt strange at first, like I was accusing someone unfairly. But the more we unpacked, the more everything made sense. She asked me once, if a friend told you this story, what would you say to her? The answer came immediately. I'd say she deserved better. I'd say she wasn't selfish. I'd say she didn't owe anyone access to her life just because they shared DNA. My therapist smiled gently and said, "Why is it harder to offer yourself the same compassion?" I didn't have an answer. Not then. But I worked on it. Slowly. Intentionally. I practiced speaking to myself the way I spoke to others. With patience. With fairness. When I made mistakes, I stopped spiraling into self-blame. When I felt tired, I rested without justifying it. These changes were subtle, but they stacked, like compound interest for self-worth. Then something unexpected happened. I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store, someone who'd known my parents for years. After the awkward pleasantries, she leaned in and said, "Your mother's been having a hard time. She talks about you a lot." There it was, the unspoken expectation that I should respond with concern, that I should reach out, that I should fix it. I smiled politely and said, "I hope she finds the support she needs." And that was it. I walked away feeling oddly empowered. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't explained. I hadn't reopened anything. I'd simply declined the role I used to play. At work, my confidence continued to grow. The certification program paid off faster than I expected. I was invited into meetings I'd never been included in before, asked for my opinion, trusted with decisions. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside and said, "You handle pressure differently now. You're steadier." I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. I'd already survived worse than any workplace challenge. Once you've rebuilt your life from scratch, office politics lose their power. Financially, I started thinking beyond survival. For years, my goals had been reactive. Pay this bill. Cover that expense. Stay afloat. Now I allowed myself to imagine more. A future not defined by recovery, but by choice. I opened a separate savings account labeled simply freedom. No specific purpose. Just options. Knowing it existed gave me a sense of control I'd never had before. My relationship with chosen family deepened too. There's a quiet intimacy that forms when people witness your worst moments and stay. We celebrated small wins together. A promotion, a paid-off loan, a completed course. They didn't minimize these milestones. They understood what they cost, and that made the victory sweeter. Every so often, a flicker of anger surfaced. Not explosive, just sharp. Usually when I thought about how differently things could have been if my parents had shown up even a little. But anger, I learned, isn't something to fear. It's information. It points to boundaries that were crossed, needs that were ignored. Once acknowledged, it softened into resolve. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. And peace doesn't come from winning arguments with people committed to misunderstanding you. I also noticed something else. Without my parents' constant commentary in my head, I made decisions faster. I trusted my instincts. I stopped second-guessing whether I was being too much or not enough. That internal critic had always sounded suspiciously like them. Without it, my mind felt quieter. One night, while reflecting on everything that had changed, I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain my choices. That urge had driven so much of my earlier life. Explaining why I needed help. Explaining why I was hurt. Explaining why I set boundaries. Now I understood something fundamental. People who care don't require explanations. And people who don't care won't be satisfied by them anyway. The idea of forgiveness came up often in therapy. Not as a requirement, but as a question. Did I want to forgive my parents? The honest answer was complicated. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't actively resent them every day. But forgiveness, as I understood it, didn't mean pretending nothing happened. It didn't mean restoring access. It meant releasing myself from the burden of expecting them to change. And in that sense, I was already there. As spring approached, I felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. My life matched my values now. stability, respect, mutual effort. I wasn't contorting myself to fit into a narrative that required my silence. Looking back, I see how the injury was the catalyst, not the cause. The favoritism, the neglect, the unequal support had always been there. The injury just made it undeniable. It forced a choice: continue accepting crumbs, or walk away from the table entirely. I chose the second, and while that choice came with loss, it also came with something far more valuable: self-respect. I don't know what the future holds with my parents. Maybe one day, there will be a conversation grounded in accountability. Maybe not, but I'm no longer waiting. My life isn't on pause. It's moving forward, steadily, intentionally, with people who meet me where I am. If there's one thing I wish I could tell the version of myself lying in that hospital bed, it's this: you will survive this. Not just physically, but emotionally. You will learn that being strong doesn't mean being abandoned. And one day, you will look back and realize that the moment they refused to help you was the moment you finally stopped abandoning yourself. By early spring, something shifted inside me that I hadn't been consciously working toward, but desperately needed. It wasn't confidence in the loud, performative sense. It was quieter than that. Heavier, like gravity settling properly in my chest. I stopped feeling like I needed permission to exist the way I did. The world hadn't suddenly become kinder, but I had become less willing to negotiate my dignity just to keep other people comfortable. One of the strangest changes was how my body reacted to stress. For years, anxiety had lived in my shoulders, my jaw, my stomach. I carried it like background noise. But now, when stressful situations came up, difficult conversations at work, unexpected bills, moments of uncertainty, my body didn't immediately tense the same way. I still felt pressure, but not panic. I trusted myself to handle things because I already had, repeatedly, alone, and survived. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me grounded. I stopped romanticizing the idea of family as an automatic safe place. I understood that safety comes from behavior, not titles. And once that clicked, a lot of guilt evaporated. The guilt that had whispered, maybe you're overreacting, maybe you're being unfair, maybe you should try harder. I had tried hard enough for a lifetime. Around this time, my parents attempted indirect contact again. Not directly to me, but through other people. A cousin mentioned they were asking questions about me. An aunt told me my mother cried when my name came up. I listened, nodded, and changed the subject. I didn't feel cruel. I felt done. Done with emotional scavenger hunts. Done with decoding half apologies. Done with being pulled back into cycles that always ended the same way. I realized something important. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from clarity. I already had that. Work continued to improve. I was assigned to lead a small process overhaul project. Nothing flashy, but important. The kind of responsibility that quietly builds trust. I spent weeks mapping workflows, identifying inefficiencies, proposing changes. When the project rolled out and metrics improved, my name was mentioned in meetings I wasn't even in. That mattered to me more than praise ever had. It was earned recognition, not conditional approval. With financial stability slowly returning, I allowed myself to rest in ways I hadn't before. Real rest. Not collapsing from exhaustion, but choosing stillness. I spent evenings on my balcony, watching the sky change colors. I cooked meals without rushing. I slept through the night without waking up to panic about money or emergencies. Peace stopped feeling temporary. One night, I had a dream about my injury. I was back in the warehouse, standing on the scissor lift, but this time it didn't tip. I stepped down safely. When I woke up, my heart wasn't racing. It felt symbolic. My nervous system was finally catching up to reality. I was no longer in free fall. Therapy sessions shifted too. Less crisis processing, more future shaping. My therapist asked what kind of relationships I wanted going forward. Not just romantic, but all relationships. I thought about it carefully. I wanted mutual effort, emotional honesty, Consistency. I wanted to stop over-functioning just to be liked. I wanted people who didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. Saying those things out loud made them feel real, attainable. I also confronted a quiet fear I hadn't acknowledged before. The fear that if I didn't keep sacrificing, I'd end up alone. That fear had kept me tethered to unhealthy dynamics longer than anything else. But now, looking at my life, the evidence contradicted it. When I stopped sacrificing myself, I didn't lose connection. I gained better ones. That realization was liberating. I started dating again slowly. Not because I needed someone, but because I was curious. Curious what it felt like to be chosen without conditions. I didn't rush. I didn't perform. I showed up as I was. And when something didn't feel right, I walked away without explaining myself into exhaustion. That was new. Empowering. Every so often, I thought about my brother. Not with anger, but with distance. I saw him clearly now. Not as someone who was intentionally malicious, but as someone who had been enabled into helplessness. Someone who expected safety nets because they had always been provided. That wasn't my burden to correct. He would either learn or he wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility. I no longer rehearsed imaginary conversations where I explained everything perfectly and finally got validation. That fantasy had faded. I understood now that people who benefit from misunderstanding you rarely want clarity. They want control. And giving up the need to be understood by them was one of the most freeing things I'd ever done. The turning point came unexpectedly one afternoon when I received a message request from my mother. A new number. Different tone. No guilt, no demand. Just a single sentence. I hope you're doing well. I stared at it for a long time. Old instincts stirred. The urge to respond. To reassure. To smooth things over. I didn't. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood that my silence wasn't punishment. It was self-preservation. I didn't know emotional access to people who had proven they couldn't handle it responsibly. That night, I wrote in my journal something that felt final. I don't need them to understand my boundaries. I need to respect them myself. Spring turned into summer. Life felt fuller. Not louder, not busier, just fuller. I invested in friendships that felt reciprocal. I laughed more. I trusted my own judgment. I made decisions without scanning for imaginary disapproval. One evening, while sitting with friends, someone asked casually, "What's the hardest thing you've ever been through?" The answer surprised even me. I didn't say the injury. I didn't say the financial collapse. I said, learning that love without support isn't love, and accepting that I deserved better. They nodded, understanding more than I expected. Sometimes the truth lands gently when you're finally ready to say it. I no longer felt the need to prove anything to my parents. Not my success. Not my stability. Not my resilience. Their recognition was no longer the finish line. My peace was. Looking back, I see how every stage mattered. The favoritism, the injury, the refusal, the rebuilding. None of it was wasted. It shaped me into someone who knows her limits, her worth, and her capacity. Someone who doesn't confuse endurance with love. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something similar, I want you to hear this clearly. Being strong doesn't mean being endlessly accommodating. Independence doesn't mean you deserved abandonment. And choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's survival. I didn't lose my family when I stopped helping them. I lost the illusion that they were ever going to show up for me the way I needed. And that loss, painful as it was, made room for something far better. A life built on honesty, boundaries, and people who show up. Not when it's convenient, but when it matters. That's what I'm building now. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. By the time summer fully settled in, I realized something subtle but powerful had happened. I was no longer living in reaction mode. For years, every decision I made had been shaped by what might happen if I didn't comply, didn't help, didn't smooth things over. What would they say? How would it look? Who would be disappointed? Now, those calculations were gone. I made choices based on what made sense for my life, my health, my future. And the absence of that constant mental noise felt like silence after a storm. The practical impact of that shift showed up everywhere. At work, I stopped volunteering for extra responsibilities out of fear of being seen as replaceable. Instead, I chose projects strategically, ones that aligned with growth, not burnout. I spoke up in meetings without rehearsing my sentences 10 times in my head. When I disagreed, I said so calmly, without apologizing for having a perspective. The response surprised me. People listened. They adjusted. Respect followed clarity. I had spent so long believing that being agreeable was the same as being valued. It wasn't. Being clear was. Financially, I reached a milestone that felt surreal. One afternoon, while updating my spreadsheet, I noticed my emergency fund had crossed 6 months of living expenses. 6 months. After everything I'd been through, the injury, the job loss, the debt spiral, that number felt like armor. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about safety, choice, time. I sat there staring at the screen, then closed the laptop and just breathed. That night, I treated myself to a small celebration. Nothing dramatic. Takeout from my favorite place. A candle lit on the kitchen table. Music playing softly. I wasn't celebrating survival anymore. I was celebrating stability. That mattered. Around this time, the family pressure made one last attempt to break through. A distant relative invited me to a reunion. The message was polite but pointed. It would mean a lot to your parents if you came. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the old tug of obligation. Then I asked myself a simple question. Would it mean a lot to me? The answer was no. So I declined. Kindly. Briefly. Without explanation. That was new too. Saying no without defending it. I didn't feel guilty afterward. I felt aligned. I noticed how my body responded to that alignment. Better sleep. Fewer headaches. Less tension in my chest. My nervous system was learning that boundaries weren't danger. They were protection. One evening, I ran into someone from my past at the grocery store. A former coworker who knew my parents casually. We made small talk, exchanged updates. Then she said, I heard things have been rough with your family. Your mom seems really stressed lately. The comment was casual but loaded. I smiled politely and said, I hope she finds what she needs. And that was it. No justification. No emotional dump. I didn't owe strangers my story anymore. Driving home, I realized how much strength that restraint took, and how natural it now felt. I thought about my parents less often, not because I was suppressing thoughts, but because they no longer dominated my inner world. When they did come up, it was with neutrality, almost like thinking about people I used to know in another life. Familiar but distant. One afternoon, my therapist asked me how I'd feel if my parents genuinely apologized. Not the vague kind. A real one. Accountability. Understanding. I considered it carefully. I said, I'd appreciate it, but it wouldn't change my boundaries. Saying that out loud felt honest. Forgiveness, if it came, wouldn't mean access. It would mean release. She nodded. That's a very grounded place to be. I felt that grounding in my daily routines. Morning coffee on the balcony. Evening walks. Weekend meal prep. These small rituals weren't exciting, but they were mine. They represented continuity. Control. A life that didn't feel like it could collapse overnight because someone else made a reckless decision. I started mentoring a new hire at work. A younger woman who reminded me of myself years ago. Overworked. Eager to please. Afraid to say no. One day, she apologized repeatedly for asking a question. I stopped her gently and said, You don't need to apologize for learning. She looked startled, then relieved. In that moment, I saw how cycles could be interrupted. Not loudly, quietly, one interaction at a time. That mattered to me more than any grand reconciliation fantasy. I also noticed that my sense of identity had shifted. I no longer introduced myself internally as the responsible one, the strong one, the one who figures it out. Those labels had been survival tools, but they were limiting. Now I saw myself as adaptable, resilient, yes, but also deserving of rest, allowed to need support, and selective about where I sought it. There was a moment, small but telling, when I realized just how far I'd come. My car needed repairs. Nothing catastrophic, but expensive enough to sting. I felt the initial spike of stress, then did something unfamiliar. I opened my budget, scheduled the repair, paid for it. No panic, no calls for help, no shame, just competence. The kind that comes from preparation, not pressure. I thought about the version of me who lay injured, broke, scared, being told to figure it out alone. I wished I could reach back and tell her that this moment would come, that she would be okay, more than okay. As summer edged toward fall, I felt ready to reflect on what I'd actually lost by stepping back from my family. The answer surprised me. I hadn't lost love. I had lost obligation disguised as love. I had lost constant self-doubt. I had lost the role of emotional insurance policy. In exchange, I gained peace, autonomy, self-respect. The cost-benefit analysis was clear. One weekend, Carlos and Amy invited me to barbecue. Friends, neighbors, kids running around, laughter everywhere. At one point, Carlos raised a toast. To chosen family, he said, clinking his glass against mine. I felt a lump in my throat. Not sadness, gratitude. Later that night, lying in bed, I reflected on how different my life looked from the outside versus how it felt from the inside. From the outside, someone might say I was distant, cold, unforgiving. From the inside, I felt warm, steady, free. That's the thing about boundaries. They can look harsh to people who benefited from your lack of them. I knew challenges would come again. Life doesn't stop testing you just because you've learned a lesson. But I trusted myself now. Trusted that I could assess situations clearly. Trusted that I didn't need to sacrifice myself to be worthy of care. Trusted that walking away wasn't failure. It was wisdom. If there was one truth I carried forward, it was this. Help given without care is control. Love without support is performance. And family, real family, shows up when it costs them something, not just when it's convenient. I didn't need my parents to change for my life to improve. I needed to stop waiting. That's what I did. And every day I wake up in a life that reflects that choice. By the time autumn arrived, the shift in my life was no longer just internal. It had begun to show on the outside in ways even I couldn't ignore. Friends commented that I looked calmer. Coworkers said I carried myself differently, more assured, less reactive. It wasn't confidence in the loud, performative sense. It was something quieter, rooted, the kind that doesn't need validation to exist. I realized this change hadn't come from success or money or proving anything to anyone. It came from finally accepting a hard truth. Some people will only value you when they can extract something from you. And when you stop supplying that value, they don't suddenly grow empathy. They grow angry, or desperate, or manipulative. That realization used to hurt. Now it felt clarifying. The silence from my parents continued. Weeks passed without contact. At first, I kept expecting another attempt, another email, another relative reaching out to mediate. But nothing came. And slowly, I stopped bracing for it. The absence itself became information. They weren't interested in repair. They were interested in relief. And since I wasn't providing it, there was nothing left to say. That understanding freed up a surprising amount of emotional energy. I poured it into my own life instead. I reworked my apartment, not for aesthetics, but for comfort. A better chair, softer lighting, a small bookshelf by the window. These weren't luxuries. They were signals to myself that my well-being mattered, that I didn't need to earn comfort through suffering anymore. Work continued to stabilize. I was given more responsibility, but this time I set clear limits. When deadlines were unreasonable, I said so. When extra hours were suggested, I asked what would be deprioritized. No drama, no apologies, just facts. My manager adjusted. Projects ran smoother. I noticed something important. When you stop overcompensating, systems either break or improve. And if they break, they weren't sustainable to begin with. One afternoon, while reviewing reports, I received an email from HR about a leadership development opportunity, a program I'd never been encouraged to apply for before. The invitation wasn't framed as charity or potential. It was framed as readiness. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then I applied, not because I felt lucky to be included, but because I knew I belonged there. That was new. Around this time, memories from my injury period surfaced more often, not as flashbacks, but as comparisons. I'd catch myself doing something ordinary like carrying groceries up the stairs or reaching for something on a high shelf, and a wave of gratitude would hit me. Not the forced kind, the grounded kind. I had my body back, my autonomy back, my life back, and I had rebuilt it without the people who once insisted they were essential. I also started noticing how often I'd been conditioned to minimize my own pain. When people asked how I was doing now, I used to say, "I'm fine, it wasn't that bad." One day, I stopped myself mid-sentence and said, "It was actually really hard, but I got through it." The response was different, more respectful, more real. I realized that when you stop downplaying your experience, others adjust their perception of you. That applied to my family situation too. When someone mentioned my parents with a tone that suggested I should feel guilty, I didn't rush to explain or soften the truth. I simply said, "We're not close right now." That was necessary for my health. No justification, no elaboration. Most people accepted that. The ones who didn't weren't safe to confide in anyway. One evening, I received a message from an old friend who knew my family while growing up. She asked gently if everything was okay between me and my parents. I told her the truth. Not the emotional details, just the facts. I was injured. I asked for help. I was refused. Later, they spent significant money on my brother. When they needed help, they came to me. I declined. There was a long pause before she responded. Then she said, "I'm really proud of you." That meant more than she probably knew. Not everyone offered that reaction. Some people couldn't reconcile the idea of adult children setting hard boundaries, especially daughters, especially the ones labeled responsible. I noticed how often strength was mistaken for obligation, how frequently competence was used as an excuse for neglect. I had lived that dynamic my entire life. I wasn't interested in continuing it under a new name. Financially, things continued to improve. I reached the point where my savings goal extended beyond emergency coverage into future planning, retirement contributions, investment options, the kind of long-term thinking I'd never felt safe enough to consider before. That safety wasn't just about money. It was about trust in myself, trust that I wouldn't abandon myself the way others had. There was a moment when I considered unblocking my parents, just to see, just to check. The thought passed quickly, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to reopen a door just to confirm it was still unsafe. Curiosity wasn't worth the cost. Instead, I focused on the relationships that felt reciprocal. Carlos and Amy, a few close friends, colleagues who respected boundaries. These connections didn't require me to shrink or perform or rescue. They existed because of mutual care, not history or obligation. I noticed how my inner dialogue had changed too. When something went wrong, my first thought was no longer, "How do I fix this before it becomes a problem for someone else?" It was, "What do I need right now?" That shift was subtle, but life-changing. It meant I responded instead of reacted. It meant I chose solutions instead of self-punishment. One night, as I was journaling, I wrote a sentence that stopped me cold. "I am allowed to outgrow the people who benefited from my silence." Reading it back, I felt a weight lift. That was the core of everything. I hadn't betrayed my family. I had outgrown a role they assigned me, without my consent. I thought about my brother occasionally, not with anger, with clarity. He wasn't malicious. He was enabled. That distinction mattered. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained it. He had never been required to develop resilience because someone else always absorbed the consequences. Now, for the first time, he was facing them. That was uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't cruelty. It's reality. I also acknowledged something difficult. If I stepped in now, I wouldn't be helping. I'd be delaying growth. For him, for my parents, and for myself. I had already paid enough for their lessons. As the year moved on, I stopped thinking of my story as one of rejection. It was a story of redirection. I was forced to rely on myself, yes. But I was also forced to choose better. Better systems. Better people. Better standards. I no longer defined family by biology. I defined it by behavior. Who shows up when it costs them something? Who listens without minimizing? Who offers support without strings attached? Those were the metrics that mattered now. One quiet Sunday, I sat on my balcony, watching the leaves fall. The air was crisp. The city moved below me. I felt present in a way I never had before. Not waiting for the next crisis. Not bracing for disappointment. Just existing. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process. And sometimes forgiveness didn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looked like release. Releasing expectations. Releasing old roles. Releasing the belief that love must hurt to be real. I didn't need closure conversations or dramatic apologies to move forward. I needed consistency. Peace. A life that didn't require me to self-sacrifice to be accepted. That's what I was building. One boundary. One decision. One quiet choice at a time. And I knew this. No matter what happened next, no matter who came back asking, no matter how the narrative was spun, I would not go back to being the person who gave until there was nothing left. I had learned the cost of that lesson, and I had paid it in full. By winter, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming felt unmistakable. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just solid. Like the difference between standing on ice and standing on concrete. I didn't wake up anxious anymore. I didn't check my phone with dread. The absence of constant emotional threat had rewired my nervous system in ways I was still discovering. There were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly. Not grief for my parents as they were, but for the version of them I had needed and never had. The kind of parents who would have shown up at the hospital. Who would have said, "Stay with us. We've got you." That loss was real. And it deserved acknowledgement. I let myself feel it without judgment, without rushing to justify or rationalize it away. Healing didn't mean pretending it hadn't hurt. It meant honoring the pain without letting it control my future. The holidays came and went quietly. I spent Thanksgiving with people who laughed easily and asked genuine questions. No tension, no walking on eggshells, no silent scorekeeping. Christmas was small. Intentional. I bought gifts without guilt or obligation. I received gifts without the sense that I owed something in return. It was the first time the season felt restful instead of draining. On New Year's Eve, I stayed home. I cooked a simple meal, poured a glass of wine, and wrote out what I wanted the next year to represent. Not goals, not resolutions, principles. Things like stability, honesty, reciprocity. I wrote down, I will no longer chase belonging in places that require me to abandon myself. When I read it back, I felt a calm certainty settle in my chest. In January, something unexpected happened. My father reached out. Not by phone, not by text, by mail. A handwritten letter. Seeing his handwriting on the envelope triggered a brief spike of adrenaline. Old conditioning. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the counter for 2 days. I needed to be sure I was grounded enough to read it without being pulled back into old patterns. When I finally opened it, the letter wasn't what I expected. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attack. It was something in between. He wrote about how hard the past year had been, about losing his job, about the move, about feeling like he'd failed as a provider. He didn't mention my injury. Not directly. He wrote about family, about regret, about wishing things had gone differently. He ended the letter by saying he hoped we could talk someday. I sat with that letter for a long time. I noticed what wasn't there. No accountability. No acknowledgement of the specific harm. No ownership of the choices that had put us here. It wasn't a bridge. It was a probe. An attempt to re-establish contact without addressing the core issue. Old me would have rushed to respond. Would have tried to smooth things over. Would have interpreted the letter as progress and met it halfway. New me understood something crucial. Closure without accountability is just another form of avoidance. I didn't write back. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. I wasn't punishing him. I was protecting myself. Until there was a willingness to name what happened and why it was wrong, there was nothing to build on. Silence in this case was honesty. That decision wasn't easy, but it was clean. Around this time, I started therapy again. Not crisis therapy. Maintenance therapy. The kind you do when you want to understand patterns, not just survive them. My therapist helped me unpack the long-term effects of being the capable child. How responsibility had been mistaken for resilience. How praise had been replaced with expectation. How neglect had been reframed as trust. She said something that stayed with me. You were parentified emotionally. You were taught that your needs were optional and other people's comfort was mandatory. Hearing it framed that way brought a strange relief. It wasn't weakness. It was conditioning. And conditioning could be unlearned. We talked about boundaries not as walls but as filters. Not everyone deserves access. Not every request deserves consideration. Discernment is not cruelty. It's wisdom earned through experience. As spring approached, my life felt fuller. Not busier. Fuller. I took a weekend trip by myself. No agenda. Just walking, reading, being present. I trusted myself in ways I never had before. Not because I was invincible, but because I knew I would show up for myself if things went wrong. I stopped telling my story with defensiveness. When people asked about my family, I answered honestly but briefly. No over-explaining. No rehearsed justifications. The truth didn't need decoration. One afternoon, my therapist asked me a question that caught me off guard. If your parents never change, can you still have a good life? I didn't hesitate. Yes. Saying it out loud felt like crossing a threshold. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't pausing my life in case they became different people. I had accepted reality as it was, not as I wished it to be. That acceptance didn't mean I was closed off. It meant I was selective. If genuine accountability ever came, I could revisit the conversation. But I wasn't holding my breath. My peace was no longer conditional. I thought back to the hospital room, to the call where I was told to figure it out, to the months of pain, fear, and uncertainty. I remembered how alone I had felt, and then I looked at the life I had built since then. The support, the stability, the self-respect. I had done what they said I could do. I figured it out, just not in the way they expected. There was a quiet pride in that, not the loud kind, the kind that comes from knowing you survived something without becoming bitter, from choosing growth over resentment, from refusing to repeat the cycle. I also realized this. Saying no had not destroyed my family. It had revealed it. The relationships that depended on my compliance fell apart. The ones built on mutual care remained. That wasn't loss. That was sorting. As the months passed, the story others told about me faded into background noise. The version where I was cold, ungrateful, selfish. I couldn't control that narrative, but I didn't need to. The people who mattered knew the truth. And more importantly, I knew it. I had learned something fundamental. Love without respect is not love. Support that disappears when it's inconvenient is not support. And forgiveness that requires self-abandonment is not healing. I no longer measure myself against my brother's trajectory, or my parents' expectations, or anyone else's timeline. I measure myself by alignment. Elf on fire to keep other people warm. Did my choices reflect my values? Did my relationships feel safe? Did my life feel like my own? For the first time, the answer was yes. And I understood this. Walking away was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. One where I chose myself without apology. One where help was mutual, not conditional. One where independence didn't mean isolation, and family was defined by action, not obligation. I didn't know what part 12 would look like yet, but I knew this. Whatever came next, I would meet it grounded, clear, and no longer willing to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. By the time summer arrived again, almost a full year had passed since the injury. A year since the phone call that changed how I understood my family forever. Time hadn't erased what happened, but it had stripped it of its power to hurt me on contact. The memories no longer spiked my chest or tightened my throat. They existed, but they didn't own me. That was the real marker of healing. I had rebuilt my life quietly, piece by piece, without announcements or dramatic turning points. My finances were stable. Not perfect, but solid. I had an emergency fund that could carry me for months if something went wrong. My credit score had recovered enough that I no longer felt embarrassed opening financial apps. I wasn't wealthy, but I was secure. And security, I learned, is a form of freedom. Work had become a place of confidence again. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I showed up, did my job well, advocated for myself when necessary, and went home without carrying the weight of proving my worth. My supervisor trusted me. My team respected me. That respect wasn't conditional. It wasn't threatened by mistakes or vulnerability. It was earned through consistency. Outside of work, my life was smaller than it used to be, but deeper. Fewer people, stronger bonds. I stopped overextending, stopped being the one who always said yes. I learned that generosity, without boundaries, eventually turns into resentment, and resentment poisons even good intentions. Carlos and his family remained a constant. We didn't talk every day. We didn't need to. The connection was steady, reliable, the kind that doesn't demand constant reassurance. On my birthday, his kids surprised me with a cake they'd helped bake. It was lopsided and overly sweet, and it meant more to me than any gift my parents had ever given me. That night, after everyone went home, I sat alone on my balcony and thought about how different my life felt. Not because everything was perfect, but because I trusted myself now. I trusted my judgment. I trusted my boundaries. I trusted that if I needed help again, I wouldn't ignore the warning signs or accept empty words. Every so often, I'd hear updates about my parents through extended family. My father had picked up contract work. My mother was trying to adjust to apartment living. They were managing, not thriving. Nathan was still with them. No house. No clear plan. The golden child without the gold. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I didn't feel relief either. What I felt was distance. Emotional distance. Like watching a storm from far offshore. It was real, but it wasn't mine to navigate anymore. I thought a lot about forgiveness. People love to throw that word around like it's a moral obligation, as if forgiveness means immediate access, reconciliation, or pretending nothing happened. I learned that forgiveness, when it's real, is internal. It's the decision to stop letting someone's actions dictate your emotional state. It doesn't require reopening doors that were closed for a reason. I forgave my parents in the sense that I no longer wished them harm. I no longer replayed arguments in my head. I no longer needed them to suffer in order for me to feel whole. But forgiveness didn't mean involvement. It didn't mean trust. And it definitely didn't mean financial rescue. One afternoon, I ran into someone from my childhood neighborhood. She asked how my family was doing. The old reflex kicked in for half a second. The urge to smooth things over, to present a version that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. Then it passed. I smiled politely and said, "We're not close, but I'm doing well." It felt honest. It felt enough. I realized something important around that time. My parents had taught me independence out of convenience, not empowerment. They withdrew support and called it strength. They avoided responsibility and framed it as trust. And I had internalized that story for years. The injury shattered it. It forced the truth into the open. They hadn't believed I would need them. Or worse, they had believed it and chosen not to show up anyway. Either way, the outcome was the same. What surprised me most was this. Once I stopped trying to earn their care, I stopped feeling deprived of it. The ache I carried for so long wasn't a lack of love. It was the exhaustion of chasing it. There were moments when doubt crept in. Late nights when I wondered if I had been too harsh, if I'd burned bridges unnecessarily. But those moments passed when I remembered the facts. I remembered the hospital bed, the phone call, the months of silence, the Thanksgiving table, the $50,000, the foreclosure warning, the sudden urgency when they needed me. Patterns tell the truth, not promises. I also thought about the version of me who might have said yes, who might have drained her savings to save them, who might have postponed her own recovery again to keep the peace. That version of me would have disappeared completely, and no one would have noticed until it was too late. I chose not to be that person anymore. One evening I wrote a letter, not to send, just to release what was left. I wrote everything I'd never been allowed to say. The anger, the disappointment, the grief. I didn't censor myself. I didn't soften the language. When I finished, I didn't feel lighter immediately, but I felt finished. I burned the letter the next morning, watched the pages curl and blacken, not as a symbol of erasure, but of completion. That chapter no longer needed my energy. Life kept moving forward. Slowly, steadily. I made plans that didn't include contingency for other people's failures. I dreamed without factoring in who might disapprove. I trusted that even if everything fell apart again, I would not abandon myself to save someone else from consequences they chose. And that was the final lesson. Being kind does not mean being available for exploitation. Being strong does not mean being silent. And being family does not mean being entitled to someone else's labor, money, or forgiveness. If you're listening to this, and you recognize yourself in my story, hear this clearly. You are not selfish for protecting what it took you years to build. You are not cruel for refusing to rescue people who refuse to rescue you. And you are not obligated to keep bleeding just because someone else calls it love. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people experience the full weight of their choices while you walk toward a life that finally fits you. I didn't lose my family. I outgrew the version of it that required me to disappear. And in doing so, I gained something far more valuable. A life built on honesty, safety, and self-respect.